Lockdown measures in place in more and more Chinese cities. This comes after wartime control measures were implemented in Shulan City last week. A European TikTok star gets blocked for resembling Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The official reason states image violation. A new report on cell phone activity around the Wuhan Institute of Virology's P4 lab last October suggests a hazardous event occurred, the lab coming under increased scrutiny as a possible virus origin. And China's influence in American universities is gaining more attention. We look at how the communist regime was involved in stifling free speech at one of the nation's most prominent universities and its history of infiltration. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Last week, one city in northeastern China had its virus risk level raised from low to high. Two other cities in northeastern China were upgraded to medium risk, including Jilin City. On May 13th, Jilin City locked down all residential blocks and closed all places of entertainment. All bus and train routes out of the city are suspended. Anyone who wants to leave the city must first register his name and show a report saying he tested negative within the last 48 hours. Restaurants are only allowed to serve takeout. Last weekend, people flocked to the city's pharmacies, panic buying antibiotics and fever, cough, and cold medicine. Authorities have now banned pharmacies, doctors' offices, and clinics from selling them. Patients with a fever or cough must go to designated clinics. Shulan City was upgraded to a high-risk area and wartime measures were issued over the last few days. A laundry lady from the city's police department tested positive last week. There's no official report on how she contracted it. Our reporter called residents in the city. They said the city's police department is now closed. Schools are also closed again. They have only been back a month. We have obtained internal documents showing that since March, the Chinese regime has been pushing local authorities to enhance testing capabilities. The latest is a May 6th document from the city Qitaihe CDC that asks hospitals that are unable to test for the CCP virus to quickly make this possible. Qitaihe is also in the northeast of China. The P4 lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology has come under scrutiny as a potential source of the virus. According to an NBC report, a hazardous event may have happened at the lab in October last year. 3 people familiar with the matter told NBC that U.S. intelligence agencies are reviewing an unofficial report on cell phone location data. The report found there was no cell phone activity around the high-security part of the P4 lab between October 7th and 24th last year. The report suggests there may have been a hazardous event there sometime between October 6th and 11th that required the lab to be closed during that time. The report talks about images from October 14th to 19th last year showing no outbound traffic from the lab. It's suspected a roadblock was set up to prevent cars and people coming and going. This is in contrast to satellite images from August to October 6th, which show a lot of activity. The next instance of activity was on October 25th. U.S. Senator Tom Cotton also spoke about the data in an interview with Fox News. Cotton said normally thousands of mobile phones are in use around this area. Wuhan has about the same population density as New York. He adds the sudden drop in cell phone usage is likely an indicator of when the virus first began spreading. He said we could get to the bottom of it a lot faster if the Chinese regime was more transparent. U.S. intelligence officials say the evidence is not enough on its own. They are still investigating. Rhodium, a research firm, reported on Monday investment between the U.S. and China has fallen in 2020 and may continue to slide due to political friction, regulatory tightening, and market dynamics. In the first quarter, Chinese venture capital investment into the U.S. slumped to $400 million from $640 million in the year before. It was $1 billion in the same period in 2018. The research firm estimated that $600 million of U.S. venture capital flowed into China in the first quarter. That's half the quarterly average for last year. The research firm said the political tension between the two countries has escalated and will continue to disrupt investment. A non-governmental organization in Ukraine has filed a lawsuit against nearly 50 Ukrainian state bodies, as well as the Chinese Communist regime, over their response to the outbreak. That's according to local media reports citing the court's press briefing. It's the first such lawsuit in Ukraine and lists 9 demands. They range from the Chinese regime paying compensation to getting the Ukrainian Ministry of Health to carry out clinical trials of various therapeutics. The court is currently considering the claim. A singer in Europe has been blocked from Chinese TikTok 3 times because he looks like Xi Jinping. Left is Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping. Right is singer Liu Keqing. Liu said his account was flagged because of, quote, image violation. In September last year, Mr. Liu's bel canto teaching videos were liked by 370,000 people in 2 days, not because the netizens love his singing, but because he looks very similar to Xi Jinping. His account was then blocked. He explained the reason in a post. Now is the eve of National Day, so many people like the name of the leader at the same time, so it was flagged. To avoid trouble, they blocked my videos. The Chinese regime's influence in American university is gaining more attention. Concerns are rising about threats to academic freedom alongside China's technology theft. Today, we look at one prominent U.S. university, Harvard, to see how the communist regime silenced discussion there, its relationship with China, and why it matters. NTD's Catherine Wen has the details.
The U.S. is stepping up its scrutiny of universities' foreign funding and contracts. The most recent case, a prominent Harvard professor was charged with hiding his ties to China's Thousand Talents plan. And that's not the only example of Beijing's influence on Harvard. Harvard's college newspaper revealed in a recent article that in 2015, a talk on China's human rights issues was canceled because at the time, the university's president was meeting Chinese leader Xi Jinping. A Chinese dissident and human rights lawyer had organized the event. Teng Biao fled to the U.S., and was a visiting scholar at Harvard. A few weeks earlier, he got a call from Harvard Law School's vice dean.
He told me I have to cancel the talk because Harvard president was meeting Xi Jinping in Beijing. And he also mentioned the programs that Harvard University cooperated with Chinese institutions. So I had no choice, and then the talk was canceled.
The Washington Free Beacon reported that Professor William Alford said the decision was his own. It wasn't from Harvard's administration. He said he asked Teng to move the event to another time, but Teng said it was never rescheduled. Alford had invited Teng to Harvard for the fellowship. Teng says while he's grateful for the position, the Chinese Communist regime's long reach cannot be ignored.
It's a typical case of self-censorship because they didn't want to anger Chinese government, and they want further cooperation with Chinese government and Chinese universities.
The self-censorship also happened to others critical of the regime. Maura Mornihan is a journalist and researcher, and she has worked with Tibetan refugees for many years. On the Epoch Times American Thought Leaders program, she recalled an encounter with a professor as an undergraduate at Harvard.
One of the professors and several of the teaching aides in my Asian seminar said that China was a socialist miracle and Tibet was doing so much better under Chairman Mao's wise leadership. So I wrote a paper saying that China was a police state and Tibet was an occupied country, and I was flunked.
Moynihan said she asked her professor about the score, and he replied that she was wrong about China.
I said, I was just in China. Have you ever been there? And he said no. And then he got really angry with me. And he did something that would have made his CCP patrons proud. He pounded the desk and said, it's going to be my job to destroy you.
She said later she found out the professor was trying to get a visa to China. Teng says many elite universities and individual scholars practice self-censorship, and this has become a threat to American academic freedom and free speech.
Let me be clear. I support cultural exchange. I support cultural exchanges with China, but there must be reciprocity, and there must be appropriate engagement without the Chinese government determining what is said and done on U.S. campuses.
Public policy think tank, the Hoover Institution, says the Chinese regime often uses partnerships as leverage. In some cases, after universities hosted the Dalai Lama or held other events the regime deemed offensive, exchange programs were suspended, or Chinese students were persuaded to choose other schools. These students are an important source of revenue for many schools. Bloomberg reports that since 2013, China has given donations and contracts to American universities totaling almost $1 billion, and Harvard is the top recipient, taking in $93.7 million. Harvard has a long history of engagement with China. Many Chinese consider it to be the #1 university in the U.S. Every Harvard president since the 1990s has visited China. The first joint programs began as early as 1979. Since then, Harvard and the Chinese Communist Party and its institutions have built a wide scope of partnership programs. While most joint efforts focus on academic collaborations, one particular program has raised concerns and earned Harvard a Chinese nickname, which translates to the Chinese regime's second central party school. In the early 2000s, Harvard's Kennedy School of Government began training Chinese officials to help them, quote, address the ongoing challenges of China's national reforms. Topics range from public policy to crisis management, globalization, and soft power. Hundreds of Chinese officials, from mayors to provincial governors and vice ministers, took the training, yet it appears there hasn't been any real sign of change in the regime. Among the Chinese officials who went through the training, some were later either investigated or sentenced for corruption. One was known for seizing a voice recorder from a reporter after he was asked a tough question, and another, a former justice official, said human rights lawyers will ruin the socialist rule of law. This former official and another who attended the training were also publicly called out for their involvement in the persecution of Falun Dafa, also known as Falun Gong. Falun Dafa is a Chinese spiritual practice. It has been persecuted by the communist regime for over 2 decades. Harvard graduate and spokesperson for the Falun Dafa Information Center, Zhang Erping, says the program risks legitimizing an authoritarian regime when it lends its name to Chinese officials.
CCP has murdered more people than the total victim number of the World War I and World War II. Training the CCP officials, some of them probably involved in the policy of suppression of Falun Gong, Christian Church, or other dissident groups. They shouldn't be welcome here on campus.
Howard Husick is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute think tank. He previously taught crisis management for Harvard in China. In a recent article, he said Harvard's involvement with Chinese officials had unexpected effects. He wrote, "As I reflect, it's possible that we planted some seeds for a freer society, but it's just as likely that we helped provide legitimacy for a totalitarian government."
Can you imagine today, Harvard University will host officials from the Nazi regime back in the 30s? That's unthinkable. We are not going to legitimize these officials' wrongdoing or even crimes and also CCP policy of suppression by further training them and further legitimizing.
Many institutions in the West assume that exposing leaders of the Chinese regime to the workings of a free society would help them accept Western norms, and they would eventually become more open and democratic. It has not succeeded.
Not only they are not abiding by the international norms, Beijing actually is setting up a new world order and for the international players to abide by.
Beijing's lack of transparency during the pandemic has forced many countries to reassess the relationship with China. As a Harvard alumnus himself, Zhang says it might also be time for Harvard to rethink its approach to the Chinese regime. Reporting by Catherine Wen, NTD News.
Today, Washington, D.C.'s mayor extended the district's stay-at-home order until June 8th. That's the longest extension in the nation. The order was supposed to end this Friday, but the mayor says the district needs more time to slow the spread. The district wants to see the daily number of confirmed cases decrease for 14 straight days. 2 full weeks of falling numbers will be an important milestone, according to their phased plan. But as of Tuesday, D.C. has seen daily new cases decrease for only 4 days in a row. For them, it's not enough. Now, nearly 7,000 have tested positive there. As of today, over 84,000 Americans have died from the CCP virus, and more than 300,000 have recovered. Sources in Canada and the United States said the countries are likely to extend a ban on non-essential travel until June 21st. The two nations had previously agreed to extend border restrictions until May 21st. Canada is now pressing for the measures to remain another month. A U.S. official confirmed that an agreement on a 30-day extension was forthcoming. The chief Canadian public health officer said the U.S. still presented a risk, but the agreement will still keep goods moving across the border. Canadian officials have been repeatedly pressed about the potential risk posed by arriving truck drivers. The United States takes 75% of all Canadian goods exports. The Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec are adjacent to the state of New York, one of the U.S.'s epicenters of the disease. A rare inflammatory illness has killed 3 young people in New York State. Researchers are studying if there is any relationship between the rare sickness and COVID-19, the disease caused by the CCP virus. So far, there is no conclusive evidence that COVID-19 is the cause. NTD's Kevin Hogan has more.
The New York State Department of Health is investigating 102 cases of a rare inflammatory syndrome in children under 21 years old. The illness presents similar symptoms as Kawasaki disease and toxic shock syndrome, such as rash, bloodshot eyes, prolonged fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. Kawasaki disease can lead to inflammation of the heart. This rare syndrome has taken the lives of 3 young New Yorkers. Attention has been growing over the possible link between the inflammatory syndrome and COVID-19. Among the scientific community, there is no conclusive evidence that shows COVID causes the inflammatory syndrome. Today, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo addressed the inflammatory syndrome and made the assumption that it is a manifestation of COVID, asserting the unproven claim that it is caused by COVID.
It's an inflammation of the blood vessels, which could affect the heart. So it's more of a cardiac case than a respiratory case, which is a new manifestation of the COVID virus.
Most of the young people who have this rare illness in New York are either COVID positive or have the antibodies, meaning they previously had COVID. But 14% of the cases tested negative for COVID and tested negative for the antibodies, meaning they did not have COVID and never had COVID. We spoke with an infectious disease expert at Johns Hopkins University. He says the inflammatory syndrome and COVID are temporally linked, simply meaning they are happening at the same time.
Right now, there have been some clusters of cases, a very small number in children that are coincident with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is an interesting linkage, but it's not proven yet.
He says we do not have all the data on this yet, and that it's important to actually prove causation before we definitively discuss this link. Kevin Hogan, NTD News, New York.
And in other news, Tesla's battle with California officials illustrates a nationwide issue: how local governments and businesses need to work together to get back to normal.
California's governor says he may investigate car manufacturer Tesla's early factory reopening, which defied county orders. He says they'll work with health officials moving forward.
And it's county-led enforcement in these cases, and to the extent their modifications are being violated, I imagine Alameda County Health Department would be the first to check in with, and we'll certainly be doing that as a follow-up as well today.
Tesla reopened the factory on Monday, but local officials say the plant should remain closed because of the lockdown. Tesla sued Alameda County on Saturday. CEO Elon Musk also threatened to leave the state and move the factory elsewhere. One business professor says reopening early could cause workers to get sick or even die.
That's a big risk to take. It's a big risk to take morally and ethically. It's a big risk to put the company to, because if that happens, you can be sure the company will be sued. You can be pretty sure the company will lose.
But many small business owners support Elon Musk and his decision. They say they're in the same boat.
And it'll never turn back to normal, not in any short period of time, but we have to come back to some normalcy, and we have to get ourselves, our economy back.
Tesla's lawsuit accuses the county of violating California's constitution by defying the governor's orders. He allowed manufacturers to reopen last Thursday. The Bay Area order has been extended until the end of the month, but counties plan to allow some limited business and manufacturing starting May 18th.
And the European Union is pushing for a gradual reopening of country borders within the bloc in an attempt to salvage the tourist season. In Italy, the daily death toll rises, but the number of new cases is falling.
The European Union is pushing for a gradual reopening of borders within the bloc, saying it's not too late to salvage some of the summer tourist season while keeping people safe. Plans include requiring face masks on airplanes and social distancing on trains. The Commission is also encouraging people to accept vouchers for canceled travel and flight bookings. That way, customers don't ask for refunds from already cash-strapped companies. Deaths in Italy climbed by almost 200 on Wednesday, against about 170 the day before. But the daily number of new cases fell to under 900 from 1,400 on Tuesday. The country's total death toll now stands as one of the highest in the world. An autonomous drone has begun delivering urgent medical supplies to a hospital on the Isle of Wight, off of England's southern coast. The aircraft can carry a payload of up to 200 pounds in a hold around the size of the trunk of a station wagon. It was developed at the University of Southampton to distribute humanitarian aid, but has been given special permission to fly in the UK and assist with the government's virus response. Professional chefs in Bangkok are cooking up around 40,000 boxes of lunch in 10 days for local communities affected by the pandemic. A local charity hired 200 chefs and dozens of taxi drivers to distribute the food. Some of the chefs are from renowned restaurants across the city, but are now living on very little income.
More than 7 weeks of measures in England, and the restrictions are being eased a little. It comes as the UK Finance Minister warns of a significant recession. Our UK correspondent has more.
Some are returning to work in England if it's not possible for them to work at home. It's part of a cautious plan set out by Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
It's a plan which is conditional and dependent, as always, on the common sense and observance of the British people and on continual reassessment of the data.
People in England can now spend more time outside, view a property and meet a friend from a different household in a public space. But they still must maintain the 6-foot rule. Garden centres are also reopening, although with distancing measures. The new rules came into play the same day the UK Finance Minister warned of a significant recession.
It is now, yes, very likely that the UK economy will face a significant recession this year. Bit by bit, we can start to reopen parts of our economy that have been closed.
In the plan, hairdressers, bars and cafes will open in July at the earliest. The latest easing of the lockdown is not so noticeable for some.
I don't see any really new difference.
But too much for others.
Once the shops start opening, then I think they should ease lockdown.
And a feeling of uncertainty remains.
Part of me's relieved, but part of me's worried about it.
50-50 to be honest with you.
In England, the message to the public has changed, with stay alert replacing stay home. But that's not the case for the devolved administrations of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. They are sticking with a stay home message for now. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
The lockdown ending in France is also a time for accountability to begin. Healthcare staff, among other groups, are criticizing the French government on how it managed the outbreak. David Vives has the details.
Different groups in France, including doctors, nurses, and even prison inmates, are accusing the government of reckless endangerment and manslaughter. More than 60 complaints are filed so far, aimed at the Prime Minister and 2 health ministers. Discontent began to rise in the country since mid-March when confinement began. According to a nurse union leader, the government is making one mistake after another. He gave an example such as the lack of masks given to healthcare people to protect them from getting contaminated and transmitting the virus to each other.
These are severe mistakes. We can expect hundreds of thousands of people infected because of the health authorities' incompetence. So we will sue the people in charge after the outbreak's gone.
The government forbade drugstores from selling masks in early March to save the limited supply for healthcare staff. It said that masks were ineffective for the public to wear. Then it flipped its stance the other way on May 7th and declared masks mandatory if you go to certain places. For the former president of a French business body, the complaints are a complicated situation to manage for French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe.
This is a threat to him to the extent that it impacts all decisions being taken now.
He said the government avoids making decisions, such as school reopening, and instead delegates the decision to mayors out of fear.
This questions the balance of our institutions, because when a general is afraid to fight a war, he's sure to lose it.
France's government started a progressive lift of lockdown measures on May 11th. Report by David Vives, NTD News.
UK researchers are looking for clues as to why this disease affects people so differently. They're starting a new study. One doctor says he'd bet his house on genetics playing a part in individual risk.
Why does coronavirus kill some people but give others not even a mild headache? British researchers will use the genes of thousands of COVID-19 cases to try and crack one of its biggest puzzles. Researchers from across the United Kingdom will sequence the genetic code of people who fell critically ill with COVID-19 and compare it with those who suffered far less or not at all. The hunt for clues about why and how people have been getting ill will involve up to 20,000 people currently or previously in hospital intensive care with the disease and about 15,000 people with mild symptoms. Scientists are still in the early stages of understanding this new disease. UK Health Minister Matt Hancock has also publicly called on people to sign up to the programme in the hope of unlocking the secrets of the virus. Some answers could come as soon as in a few weeks from a study of almost 2,000 people already underway, although by testing more people it will ensure data signals are genuine. The results will then be shared globally.
Johns Hopkins University launched a free online course on contact tracing this week, as contact tracers are wanted to join the fight against the pandemic.
A tracer's job is to track down anyone who might have been infected by a person recently diagnosed with the CCP virus so they can quarantine themselves and prevent further spread. The 5-hour course is offered by the university's Bloomberg School of Public Health. It's required for the thousands of contact tracers that New York is hiring, but it's available to anyone who's interested. New York State is hiring up to 17,000 contact tracers. Johns Hopkins estimated the U.S. will need at least 100,000 contact tracers to safely reopen.
Here at China in Focus, we dedicate ourselves to bringing you truthful, unbiased reporting. Don't forget to subscribe for the latest updates and see you tomorrow.